You know how they always start spooky stories with, "It was a dark and stormy night." That got me thinking, could we weave some sort of ghost overshot? Let's give it a try. I've drawn up this cute little ghost pattern with some stars in the sky. Let's weave this up and see how it turns out. So before I even get started, I'm actually gonna cut my fringe. And for that fringe, I'm gonna be using 7mm cotton string. This is my go-to lately. I like that I don't have to steam it out. I like that I only need one strand per fringe grouping. And in the case of this piece, I am gonna be double warping, but each grouping of the fringe is gonna go around 4 strings. So I'm gonna cut myself about 13 pieces of my fringe, and I'm gonna just use the width of my loom here. Get some scissors, and I'm just gonna wrap this around 13 times. I like to use a double warp for overshot, so I'm going to do that. So technically my pattern is 27 warp strings long, but I'm actually going to warp on 54 warp strings, giving me that double warp. Is that correct math? Yeah, that was right. I find when I weave an overshot, the warp just gets really, really tight since we're weaving that plain weave between pattern rows. And so I'm gonna try to make sure that I don't put my warp on too tight to begin with. Okay, and my piece is not centered on the loom, which is also always something that like bugs me just a little bit, but it is what it is. I'm gonna lay down the base for this piece with a piece of cardstock, and I'm actually weaving over 2 under 2 for this part because there's really no reason we need to go over 1 under 1 right now. That will just save us a lot of time doing it this way. So I'm gonna start this piece like I always recommend you guys start your pieces, and that is with a twining stitch and about 3 rows of plain weave. We actually have a whole video showing you exactly how I like to start my woven wall hanging, so if you want to check it out, I'll put a link in the description box below. Now I'm going to take my fringe, and using a Ryan knot, I'm gonna work around 4 strings at a time. And what I'm gonna try to do here is, as I'm tying on this fringe, I'm just making sure that I'm not like twisting the warp strings, which could cause us some grief later. Okay, so for this last grouping of fringe, you can see that we're left with 3 groups of 2 instead of only 2 groups of 2. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna split them in half for the last 2 pieces of fringe. So I'm taking a total of 5 strings and a total of 5 strings. So for this grouping, I'm gonna go around 3 strings on the right, 2 strings on the left, and that will be 1 grouping. And then I'm just gonna do that same thing on this last grouping of fringe. I'm gonna take, you know, this plied yarn again and just do a quick twining stitch, and then we can get started with the pattern. All right, so we have that twining stitch in, we're ready to start with this overshot pattern. I'm going to be using, so for the weft, I'm using Lion Brand Woolies Thick and Quick. It's just the off-white color, and I'm going to be using Bernat Handicrafter cotton for my tabby rows. This is a little bit thicker than 8/8 cotton, and I do prefer that for this, just to fill out those plain weave rows. But if all you have is the 8/8 cotton, you can definitely use that too. I'm gonna grab a second needle for overshot. It's significantly more efficient to have 2 tapestry needles because we're constantly going back and forth with one yarn and then the other over top. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna go in with my plain weave with my thin yarn. So that's going to be over 1 under 1 all the way across. And I can already feel like my warp has gotten a lot tighter already. So I probably could have even made it a tiny bit looser, but sometimes it's just hard to gauge when you're first starting. So I'm gonna beat that down all the way on top of the twining. I realized just a minute ago, when I created this pattern, I actually made it so that these stars are a darker color. I'm just gonna weave the whole pattern with off-white and see what that looks like. Like, will it look better off-white? Will it look better with 2 colors? I don't know, but I'm feeling the black and white for Halloween right now, so I'm gonna try that. I'm gonna be treating for the pattern rows, every block equals 2 warp strings instead of only 1. But then with the plain weave row, we're going to be doing the over 1 under 1. So I'll show you what that looks like. So for this first section, since my weft string is coming under these strings, I'm gonna cheat this a little bit. That's just the way it ended up with the way I did the twining. So on this one, I'm gonna go over 2. Remember, 1 block equals 2 strings. So over 2, under 2. And this one, this first row is actually just like a plain weave. So over 2, under 2, all the way across. But on the last one, I am going to go under 4 like the pattern says to do. So I'm pulling that through, creating my arch. You can give the warp a strum and then beating that down. And then now that we have our first pattern row in, we can go back in with the tabby, remembering that the tabby is, or plain weave, is going over 1, under 1. So now I'm ready to start with my second row. I like to just kind of put my tabby yarn up here, and we're going back to our thick weft yarn. And I'm gonna cover up the rest of the row so I don't get lost here. So now in this row, I'll be going over 2, under 2, and this is 5 blocks, so I'm actually gonna go over 10 strings, under 2, over 10, under 2, over 10, under 2, over 10, and then under 2, over 2. And now we can go in once again with our tabby. Then the next row is almost identical to the previous row. I'm putting my tabby yarn up. This time we're going under 4, and then we're going over 10, under 2, over 10, under 2, over 10, under 2, over 10, under 4, and then back with the tabby. So it's really the same way all the way up. So I'm treating each block of the pattern rows as 2 warp strings, and then continuing on with the tabby just being over 1, under 1. Okay, I actually went and wove my pattern row with my tabby, so now I have to unweave, and it's just all part of it. And I'm sure if you've been around here for a while, you know I talk a lot about there's no shame in the unweaving game, and there truly isn't. You should never feel bad about it. It's just part of it. You're gonna mess up sometimes, and it's totally okay. So I'm paying really close attention to my sides as I'm weaving, because this kind of piece can really easily get away from you and start sucking in. So I'm trying to be really intentional as I go. We just have to make sure we're not pulling too tight. We're giving enough slack so that we can have those straight edges that we want. Oh, I missed a little block here. Of course, when you download this pattern, this mistake will be fixed. But I just realized I didn't have this colored in, and it should have been. So that makes my life a little easier, because I was thinking, how am I gonna do that? So I don't have enough white to go back across, so I'm gonna leave this hanging out here. I'm gonna grab another length. I think this time I might grab a little bit more than I did the first time, and I'm just gonna start it again. But as I often like to do, since my next row starts by going under the warp strings, I'm actually just gonna go ahead and loop this around, except this way. So I'm just looping that around so that it's actually attached on the edge, because in this case I do want it to be. And because we're not gonna have a ton of ends to tuck in this piece, it doesn't matter so much if you start and stop on the same edge. So I'm just gonna go ahead and do that. And then I can keep going with my pattern. So I'm also ending with my black here. So same thing, I'm just gonna loop that back around and grab a new piece. I finished doing my pattern once, and I want to do it again, I think, because I think that would be like the perfect size. If I do it one more time, we're going to end up around this mark, which I think will be like the perfect length for a woven wall hanging in this case. But what I'm nervous about is if I just start the pattern again, that the ghosts are gonna probably be too close to my last row, and it's not like this being the ghost isn't gonna come through as much. So what I want to try is actually doing another row of plain weave before we start the pattern again. So I'm going to try that, and we're going to see if it works, because I don't want to do a twining stitch really at this point, because I feel like that's maybe too abrupt for in the middle of this piece. So I'm wondering if we can just get away with doing just an extra row of this plain weave in the black to give the sections of the pattern a little bit of separation, if that makes sense. I think I'm only gonna do one row, and we'll try weaving in the pattern to make sure. You can see I'm constantly like pulling at the sides of this piece to make sure I'm not letting it get sucked in too much, because I can see there's a little bit going on here. And a little bit is normal. I just want to make sure that I'm paying really close attention to not letting it go too far. Now I'm going to start on the pattern again. And just like at the beginning, I think ultimately what might be better is to go over 2, under 2, and then continue on with the pattern. So my warp is definitely getting super tight at this point. So I'm hoping that I can get the rest of the way through the pattern without it getting too tight. So this is one of those projects, especially just Overshot in general. You do want to warp your loom a little bit looser than you would for other types of projects. But because we're going in with a double warp and we're doing all this plain weave, it just really gets tight throughout the piece. I'm trying to figure out how I want to finish off this piece. Originally, I was thinking of finishing it off with a twining stitch with the white yarn, but now I'm wondering if maybe I should do it with the black yarn, in which case I'm gonna have just enough of the white yarn to finish the pattern. But I have a feeling that might actually look a little better. So let's give it a try. It's looped around this way, so I want to work my twining that way so that I can pull it as tight as I want it without it sucking in this string. So I've started a separate string for that so it doesn't pull in too much. Now I think we're ready to start with the finishing of the back. So I'm gonna flip my loom over. And oh my goodness, can we talk about the back for a minute? This is actually really cute on the back too, with the ghosts are black instead of white. So I'm pulling all the tails from the front to the back so we don't miss any. I love these little plastic yarn needles. You can get them pretty much anywhere yarn is sold. They're handy for this part of the process. And I'm just gonna start tucking in these ends. So there's not really, actually I could go up here. So I'm gonna go up through this channel here, and I'm grabbing just the loops on the back of the piece so that it doesn't show in the front. And then once it's tucked in, I can trim off the ends. And over here, I'm actually gonna go down through this channel. So I'm grabbing again, just the loops on the back of the piece, and I'm gonna go down. And I might even, what's going on here? I might even grab one of these ones because these ones are a little bit tighter, so they're gonna hold the yarn in a little bit better. So I'm gonna grab that one and trim it off. And I'm gonna do the same thing with the rest of the thick yarn. So now with these ends with the black yarn, I'm gonna basically do it a very similar way. So for this particular one, I'm gonna go up through these white wefts. Again, just grabbing the loops in the back, and that should be good there. These two I think I'm gonna tuck in together because this yarn isn't very thick, so I don't think it's gonna be a big deal to do that. So I'm just gonna sew them, I think down this way, and then I'm gonna scooch over to here, and that should be plenty there. So now we're ready to take this off of the loom. Now, my warp is super, super tight on this loom, so I'm a little bit nervous about trying to pull it off of the loom, but the first thing I'm gonna do is actually pull out the cardstock because that should help loosen up the warp a little bit because there's just less stuff in the warp, and I can feel like it's quite a bit looser now. So then what I'm gonna try to do, and I can slip it right off, just be really careful with this. If your warp feels really, really tight and you have this, one of our looms, you can just take out these screws, take off the notch bar, and then you don't have to worry about potentially breaking off one of the notches. So now before we put this on a dowel, I'm gonna go in and tie all these strings into knots. I think we're gonna try to tie together 2 loops at a time, just to save us from having excessive knots. We'll see if these are long enough and if that's gonna be super annoying. here's what we need to decide here, because these warp strings are really, like, we've got 8/8 cotton and we double warped the loom. So there's a lot of warp strings down at the bottom here. So I think what I want to try is to just trim off. I'm just a little nervous here. I think I just want to trim off the strings in the back instead of actually tucking them in, because it's going to create so much bulk if we try to tuck those in. Now we need to attach this to a dowel. Since I have 27 loops, I'm going to grab 3 loops at a time. I'm opening them all up together. I've shown you guys this before. We have a whole tutorial just on this if you're curious and you need more instruction, but I'm opening them all up together, flipping that loop forward, and then bringing the 2 tails together. And then that will slip right over top of our dowel, creating this nice little loop grouping. And I just realized I forgot my little trick. So once you open them, you flip them forward. I'm gonna flip them forward again and bring those 2 loops together. And what this does is actually gonna shorten that length a little bit. It creates a little bit of a braid effect and it locks onto the dowel better. So I'm gonna continue doing that, opening 3 up, flipping them forward, bringing the tails together, bringing the loops together, I should say. Then I'm gonna twist those again and slip them over the dowel. So now we need a little hanging string. So I'm gonna grab the same string I used for the warp, and I'm just going to loop this around and tie it in a knot. So now is the part where we need to take a look at the fringe. We're gonna switch back to the regular backdrop. Let's do that now. And I'm going to figure out the length of my fringe. I like to use the groove of my table as like a cutting guide. It's been really handy. It definitely wasn't built with that purpose, but it totally works. So what I'm doing is I'm like seeing how far down from my raya knots I wanna be. And that looks pretty good there. And then I'm literally just gonna glide my scissors along the groove of my table and cut off this fringe a little bit. That actually worked really well. So now I'm just gonna like make sure it actually looks pretty straight, and it looks not bad. That works really well. So definitely pro tip, if you have grooves on your table, you can use them as a cutting guide. And then I'm just gonna double check that everything looks pretty straight. Click this playlist to watch more of our weaving pattern tutorials and head over to spruceandlinen.com to grab this pattern.